Okay, let's go. So, hello everyone, good day to you. Welcome to the Maritime London webinar on maritime safety, geopolitical pressures, green technology and human factors. This webinar forms part of the Maritime London contribution to UK Maritime Safety Week, organised by the Department for Transport. In the next 60 minutes, we hope to cover how conflicts and dark fleet activity may be driving ship and seafarer abandonment, how alternative fuels are driving new safety and training challenges, and how an aging non-compliant fleet, also known as the shadow fleet or dark fleet, may be causing increased navigational and environmental safety concerns. My name is Mark Williams. I'm the CEO of Maritime London, and I will be moderating this webinar. To discuss these issues, we have this stellar panel with me today. We have, first of all, MICHELA BORZONI, the Head of Sustainability at West of England Shipowners Mutual Insurance Association. She took on the role there in 2025, bringing her experience from the insurance and reinsurance sectors. MICHELA has an academic background in environmental policy and leads the development and execution of the club's sustainability strategy, overseeing progress and sustainability reporting. Mark is a partner at DWF's London office, specialising in marine insurance and shipping. He qualified in England and Wales in 1994, and he specialises in salvage, general average and insurance in marine and non-marine coverage issues and litigation, including piracy. He also covers Red Sea casualties, including war risk, misappropriation and other policy issues, liability and coverage issues, including drafting policy wordings. And our final panellist, Captain Gordon Lowe, Master Mariner with Solis Marine, based in London. Gordon provides expert mariner advice and reports on marine casualties and disputes. His work covers collisions, groundings, navigation and vessel manoeuvring, cargo operations, stowage and lashing, mooring, cargo damage, loss and shift, safety management systems, and a host of other dangerous activities and consequences. So that's our panel, and without further ado, I think we should leap into our topics. There is a Q&A, so if you have any questions for the panel, then feel free to type them into the Q&A box. You can click on the Q&A on your menu bar at the top of your Teams window, and I will look through the Q&As as we go through, and I'll try and drop some of those questions in at appropriate moments. But first of all, I want to focus on events in the Middle East. You know, the memorandum of understanding seems to have collapsed in the last 48 hours, and we're back to a state of effective war. So I wanted to focus just a little bit on that. And panelists, with one eye on the dark fleet situation, do you think that this conflict in the Middle East is going to lead to not just increased navigational risks, which clearly are happening with attacks on commercial shipping, but is this going to lead to another step change in seafarer abandonment? And what can be done to minimize such cases? Perhaps, Gordon, I could come to you first on that.
Yep. How to say? It's obviously huge change, even just overnight. I know it's unprecedented levels of abandonment in 2025, and it's only set to increase. There are a lot of ships that are, quite frankly, just stuck in the behind the Strait of Hormuz, can't possibly move due to the risk. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that's going to get worse before it gets better.
Mark, can I come to you from the legal perspective? Where does commercial shipping sit now that the memorandum of understanding seems to have collapsed?
I think in an increasing state of flux. The new norm in the Gulf seems to be there's a peace deal one day, then there's not the next couple of days, and the seafarers are unfortunately caught in the middle of this. There's some reports that up to 11,000 seafarers are at risk of abandonment. The UN and the IMO have taken this right to the top of their agenda, although after the last peace deal, the UN said that the potential rescue efforts that they're going to put in place have been put on hold. That will obviously have to be revisited. A number of ships obviously got out during this limited window. I think it was up to about 44 ships a day at best, but obviously everything is now tracked. Anecdotally, I think the seafarers themselves are being looked after and being supplied, but it's a terrible time for them and their families, of course, who are deeply worried about them. And there have sadly been a number of deaths, both on tugs and on vessels that have been hit by missiles, including by the Americans, unfortunately. As to whether those seafarers are truly abandoned, I think that's not the case, and most owners are supporting the crew. But away from the Gulf for a moment, with the geopolitical situation, let's not forget that piracy is re-emerging as a threat, and there are a number of ships, including the Honour 25, that have been seized, and there's a lot of debate as to whether the Djibouti Code of Conduct and the Jeddah Amendment is actually working to get those seafarers safely out of the grip of the pirates. But if the pirates are using the same model as they did a number of years ago, then the crew are the pressure point for ransom. There's also, as you've rightly alluded to, Mark, the dark fleet issue. And I think in the press the last couple of days is a prime example. India detained 3 ships, just get the names, the Stella Ruby, the Asphalt Star, and the Chiltern, which was the Al Jafsia, and has ordered that they be sent for scrap. But the seafarers on those ships had been abandoned. So the Bombay High Court had to, Mumbai High Court, I'm showing my age there, had to order that they be released. So there was 50 seafarers that had been properly abandoned, but they've now been repatriated. What we've also seen from casualties within the Gulf is that the crew, when a ship has been hit and has been abandoned, either because it can't be salvaged or saved at that moment in time, thankfully, most of the crew who have survived have been able to get off ships and been repatriated safely. But it's a terrible time for the seafarers, and there's a lot of people affected, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And Michaela, what's the P&I take on this?
Well, abandonment is something that we do have to keep a close eye on. And I think, generally speaking, in times where there is a lot of conflicts and geopolitical tension, abandonment is more of a heightened risk. And so to define abandonment more specifically under the MLC, seafarer abandonment, it happens when seafarers, they fail to fulfill their obligations to the crew, leaving them without the proper support, often wages, and there's failure to repatriate. And so at this time, we are finding that there has been an increased risk. As Gordon mentioned, I think 2025 was probably the worst year that we had on record, but we're not seeing massive improvements in 2026. And so really where we stand is we want to ensure that we want to minimise abandonment, and that's really working with the ship owners, understanding those ships that ultimately we're supporting through P&I, making sure that there's proper financial checks, security checks, working with flag states, port state enforcement, and allowing the repatriation of abandoned seafarers is incredibly important to ensure that it's not a prolonged issue. And so it's very much ensuring that we have a full understanding of what's going on, not just from a geopolitical standpoint, but also we need to make sure that we understand what's going on within our own fleets. And so it's very much something that we are focused on and continue to build an understanding of.
Thank you. I noted that in May at the last Maritime Safety Committee meeting at the IMO, there was a statement put out about the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. The committee adopted a resolution requesting the support of IMO member states for the Secretary General's ongoing efforts to facilitate the safe evacuation of ships and seafarers trapped in the Persian Gulf. The committee urged member states and organizations to assist trapped seafarers by providing essential supplies, by establishing helplines and remote support, and keeping families informed, and crew changes were also encouraged. The committee requested the Secretary General to closely monitor the situation and provide regular updates to member states and relevant IMO bodies, and also approved new guidance on training and certification of seafarers affected by the situation in the Arabian Sea, the Sea of Oman, and the Gulf region, particularly in and around the Strait of Hormuz. That training was aimed to provide temporary practical measures to help seafarers at flag states and port authorities manage maritime certificates affected by disruptions in the region, while still upholding safety and environmental standards under the STCW Convention. Now, and thank you for bearing with me while I read that one out, but it seems to me, we can have all the conventions we like and we can have all the best practice we like. Is it time, especially with the likely removal of much of the dark fleet over the coming years and with continuing conflict in the Middle East, almost an inevitability, given that it's been ongoing for decades anyway? Is it not time that shipping somehow put together like a backstop fund, like you have for oil spills, a backstop fund for repatriation of abandoned seafarers?
Mark, I'll jump in there. I was on a presentation earlier this week where Stefan Hennig, this UK Solis rep, was on a panel, and the same topic cropped up as to a fund to deal with ports of refuge. And the concept of a fund maybe to sort that when you have dark fleet vessels involved. I think it's something that would have to be developed. Probably would need the lead from industry to then guide governments and the IMO. The IMO is a wonderful organisation, but as it's a consensual body, it can take some time to get some of these measures through, whereas industry can move more at pace. And actually, I'd like to give a shout out to the P&I and the insurance world in this sphere, because if you look at Ukraine and the response of P&I and insurers, they got the crew out in the vast majority of circumstances, utilising security companies such as Ambre and the like to get seafarers out. So the industry can assist, but the dark fleet is a problem where there's no valid insurance involved or sanctions. So that's a difficulty.
Yeah. And Gordon, from a master mariner's perspective, if you're on a vessel that's north of the Strait of Hormuz and it seems like one day the strait is open and you can leave and then you stop and you turn around, I mean, what does this do for seafarer well-being and mental health?
I think, mental health is something that we can't, talk enough about. The connectivity these days, there's so much information, so many worries, and so many news avenues that are coming to the ships. And I think being realistic, quite often the master is not fully au fait with all of the details about the ship, the ownership, the various structures. To the point that he or she isn't the best person to make the call on go or no go. We have had situations whereby new ships have transited Hormuz or through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and have been hit, and they had just recently been sold. But when you trace back the history of those vessels, the ownership and various other considerations, that was very much, or we suppose that was very much the reason that they were attacked. Now, ship's just been sold, full new crew. Does that master signing on really have the ability to know the full details about that vessel? So yeah, it's worrying time, and I know everybody advocates full connectivity on the ships, but actually we're in a time where maybe less information is better. There's so many daily news stories and avenues to get information which wouldn't have been possible 20, 30 years ago. So.
Yeah, I can remember 30 years ago being involved in tracking assets on behalf of solicitors. We had an army of nanas sat on headlands with binoculars and notebooks writing down IMO numbers of passing vessels. It's rather different, but of course AIS can be spoofed. Will the rise of VDES make a difference to that level of transparency? Is that going to make life easier or harder for the security and safety of ships and seafarers?
Yeah, Mark, I'll jump in there again. I think the issue of spoofing AIS and the public availability of this information is an issue. both for seafarers and for the wider world. And there's an ongoing debate as to whether that information should be available. And in fact, as I understand it, isn't it Russia who's suggesting to the IMO that that AIS information should not be publicly available, probably for other reasons. But with that level of visibility, the issue of spoofing, which I know we'll come on to a little bit later, Mark, there's many concerns there. And from a crew position, I'm sure Gordon can talk more to this, have mariners the ability to still navigate by looking out of the window and with paper charts when there may no longer be paper charts on board? If the systems go down, which would include communications and AIS and ARPA and collision avoidance systems.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a standard scenario during your bridge team resource management, losing the GPS signal. I think mainly for the guys on board, the spoofing is more of an issue because it's more difficult to see immediately if you lose. If the GPS is being jammed, it's a bit easier to understand that it is being jammed. I know there are bits of kit on the market that will give you an indication that there is jamming or spoofing in action. But yeah, certainly if your position's been spoofed, it is much more difficult to detect. And as Mark mentioned, if other systems are not working and you don't have the paper charts, it can potentially lead to groundings or other issues. Navigational concerns, let's say.
Yeah. Gordon, on that point, and especially with regard to the increasing shortfall in trained officers, especially engineers, but also navigation officers, what are the safety implications of that shortfall? Can technology replace human inputs in any or all situations? And how do we balance safety with the relentless commercial pressures, sometimes contradictory, around speed, make all due haste, but also efficiency and cost reduction? Are we simply asking too much of crews?
I think the technology is part of the answer. I mean, we've seen over the years, even something as simple as your plan maintenance system being automated and all the manuals being integrated into that. You get some kind of predictive maintenance whereby it can order up the the spare parts basis of the the instruction manual. If you do an overhaul that needs XYZ spare parts, and simple things like that are already long time in the industry, do reduce down the the paperwork burden, etc. But I've been on ships recently that have had some kind of AI detection system on the bridge for detecting targets and buoys, yachts, smaller objects. It does come down to are the guys and girls on the ships these days actually capable of looking out the window, and should they be relying on AI or technology to deal with that function? Yeah, I mean, I know BIMCO and ICS put out a warning. I think it was maybe this year or maybe late last year, that we have a projected shortage of about 100,000 officers, and that is officers senior level, especially engineers, by 2030. And quite obviously that has a huge safety implication, because if we don't plug that deficit, what are we going to do? We're going to promote early. We're going to water down the standards maybe, and at some point that is going to result in fatalities, casualties, or some kind of problem or issue, which as a consultant is okay because it keep us busy, but it's not good for the industry. But as I think will be mentioned in more detail, the influx of alternative fuels mean that these officers are being demanded to do more, to have more knowledge, and it's quite quite noticeable in the industry that there is a bit of a lack of, the training centres and, that have the expertise to do these kind of bespoke courses. And
let me bring, sorry to interrupt,
sorry.
let me bring MICHELA in at that point, please, because this is a subject I know that's very close to MICHELA's heart. I mean, what are the safety implications that derive from the retrofitting of environmental technology on board vessels or construction of ships designed to use these alternative fuels?
Yes, definitely. And so, I mean, there are many drivers for why ship owners would want to start to consider retrofitting, whether it's the IMO carbon targets or EU ETS or fuel maritime. There's a whole suite of eco regs that are facing ship owners today. But also, there are other factors such as extending the life of commercial vessels, improving competitiveness, and preparing vessels for future fuels and technologies. And so, certain retrofitting examples include energy saving devices. It could be wind assisted propulsion, shore power capacity, as well as carbon capture systems. There are various different technologies that are there. And the benefits are to some extent obvious, some being to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which would then comply with some of those eco regs. But also over time, we would expect to see lower operating costs. Again, I mentioned extending the lifespan of the vessel and ultimately leading to a more orderly transition. And from a P&I perspective, a sustainable fleet is one that remains more commercially viable, which is important in a consideration. However, I think one thing we all need to bear in mind that a retrofit is just not simply an engineering modification. It does change the way in which seafarers operate a vessel, and there are certain considerations that come with that, as well as risks around stability. It could be structural integrity. We have to think about fire safety, electrical systems, confined spaces, and crew competence. And ultimately, when we think about alternative fuels more specifically, whilst the benefits are clear when we think about that orderly transition, the risk profile differs. Whether in the case of ammonia, it could be toxicity and crew exposure at various different levels. Methanol is flammability, batteries could be thermal runaway, etc. And so crews need to be resilient as we start to think about kind of these retrofitting options, but also we can't simply just ask crews to do more where there are fewer crew in existence. And so it's really thinking about supporting them through training, making sure that they're understanding those technologies. And actually, I think what's preferable is bringing them into the conversation early so that they have an understanding of what that retrofit requires, how to deal with it, and ultimately it's tapping into more competent skill sets, and that requires whole industry collaboration. And it's not just an obligation on the ship owner, but also thinking about how we can all, as part of that ecosystem, really support these decarbonisation efforts, which is going to be absolutely vital. As today, those who are in the UK, we can clearly see we're into our third week of a heat wave. These changes are apparent, they're here, and decarbonisation is absolutely important. And so this really is a whole industry collaborative effort to ensure that we can not only move towards retrofitting and decarbonisation, but bring that seafarer into the conversation, make sure they have what they need, and they are ultimately supported so that we can all move towards a decarbonised world.
To all of you, does this mean that ship owners and operators via crewing agencies are just going to have to learn to pay more for crew because you're giving them more responsibility, you're asking them to operate in potentially more hazardous environments with ammonia's toxicity and methanol's propensity to have invisible flames, and you don't know you're on fire until you start to feel it, and it also has sort of toxicity elements as well. The training is going to be difficult, isn't it? Because we still only have interim guidelines from the IMO for the use and adoption of these fuels. So how do you train to that level and then potentially retrain later? And the seafarers, via organisations like the Seafarers Happiness Index, are saying we're happy to take on the extra responsibilities and the extra roles, but first of all, you've got to pay us more for the extra responsibility we're taking on. And also you need to have sort of bigger crews with more stable shifts, because the biggest issue on board vessels is tiredness, which is leading to anxiety and low performance. So is it just really just a question of, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys? You need to pay sort of better fees to get better trained, more able seafarers.
And where do you find them from, Mark? It's the skill shortage, and also with the great, where do you get the bodies from to fill these roles and to train them? I know there's a huge concern in the professional salvage industry as well about where the next professional salvors come from and how the salvors can cope with the new technology if there's a casualty or an incident. Simply put, no professional salvor has yet had to deal with one where it's fueled by, say, ammonia, and how do they respond if there's a major casualty situation or a collision between two ships with alternative fuels on that may be different fuels on each ship. But yes, Mark, I think you're right. The industry would have to get used to the idea of paying more if technology is going to progress at this pace.
Yeah.
Then, of course, we have the difficulty about the dark fleet. If that's here to stay, how's that going to work if you have poorly maintained and possibly poorly crewed ships on the dark or shadow fleet?
Well,
Yeah.
I think this, sorry.
Go ahead, Michaela.
Just to quickly add, I think this is a really multifaceted conversation. I mean, ultimately, we do have the question of pay, but we also need to think, I mean, AI, as much as we talk about it in the industry, is going to ultimately play more of a role as we think about retrofitting and some of those obligations. And where can we see technology also supporting the advancement of decarbonisation? We also have to think this is now a new generation. We're in a kind of a new sphere where we're thinking about some of these energy saving devices and these retrofitting measures. As kind of young cadets go into those training programs, we need to ensure that it's well covered within the program and that training is from right at the beginning, not kind of part way through their careers, as we know that this is going to be a huge change. And we have to really think, beyond that, there's so many different levers that I think would really assist here beyond just kind of monetary value, but also thinking about it's the technology, it's the monetary value, it's the training, it's the support, it's making sure that we have really good and positive atmospheres on board, which is all part of the conversation, because ultimately workload has increased. We need to make sure that when these seafarers are not working, that they can rest and they have that time that they can take to themselves, which is just equally as important. So I think with all things shipping, there's many aspects to the conversation.
Yeah, and Mark, I think one thing that's not really been taken into account yet, even with apologies to Michaela referring to another P&I club, but Guard have just issued their crew claims report for 2026, which deals with issues of fatigue when injuries occur. But they acknowledge that report is not taking into account yet the impact of mental wellness and well-being. And I think the geopolitical situation is going to lead to a lot more mental wellness issues that no one has any idea how the impact is going to be on these seafarers yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. So do you think that the biggest safety challenge today is it political, is it regulatory, is it technological, or is it old-fashioned human behavior?
I think it's a combination of all of them, to be honest. As Michaela said, it's multifaceted. Safety, I think, is said by most of the industry to be their highest priority. It's whether people are actually delivering and acting on those words. I think all reputable owners and reputable insurers all believing it and pushing it. But is that widespread across the whole industry? Probably not. If shipping is as it's always been, not necessarily putting the human element first and focusing on numbers.
Interesting, thanks. Gordon, let me come back to you and just move the conversation on a little bit, if I may. And also come back to the dark fleet and the sanctioned fleet. With AIS spoofing, as you've mentioned, and unpredictable routing behavior increasing as vessels try to route around zones of conflict and bottlenecks and difficult geographies. What are the risks to the physical safety of vessels and to the environment of these mostly overage ships continuing to trade? Thinking particularly from a master's perspective, what are the safety risks? Is watchkeeping becoming ever more vital?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that these ships, obviously, with the AIS off, I mean, it shouldn't be an issue for a good ship with good watchkeepers. But yeah, they commonly do not act as they should because they're, are stateless. They feel somewhat above everybody else. But the main concern, and I think it was point that Mark made, is these are older ships. They're quite often a flag of convenience. Stateless. They probably they'll not be covered by the the normal insurance. And yeah, the main one is salvage and grounding and wreck removal concerns is really the biggest safety concern. Obviously, because of the lack of insurance, biggest concern for the crew really would be, if anything does happen, can they get repatriated? Is their contract valid? It's pretty much a wasted bit of paper, I guess, for many of these guys, which is why, it was on a conference last week with the Nautical Institute here in London. And they did say that the easiest or the most appropriate thing if you're joining a ship and you're a little bit concerned is put the IMO number into into any one of the databases online, because there's a huge uptick in the number of poor flags like Equatorial Guinea, Sierra Leone, that unfortunately are not like Panama, who have expelled a lot of the sanctioned ships and problematic ships. They are just allowing these vessels to continue. So
Yeah. Yes, Nautilus is an interesting point you make, because I think Nautilus worked with the UK Chamber of Shipping and the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union to come up with new guidance for onboarding and crew transfer operations, didn't they? So guidance was covering things like familiarization with the new vessel, the handover, and they recommended particularly that there should be a dedicated familiarization manager and clearly defined crew responsibilities with crew feedback mechanisms like surveys and suggestion boxes also being encouraged. I mean, these sound like great procedures, and shipping is very process driven at sea these days. There's a handbook for everything that you do from the start to the end of the voyage. So we have excellent procedures on paper, but they aren't always followed in practice. And even if they are followed in practice, sometimes there are risks to safety that were unforeseen. They might be externalities. So why does the gap exist between procedure and practice? And whose responsibility is it to close that gap?
I think that would have to rest squarely on the ship owner, to be honest. There's lots of bodies that are doing some superb work. I mean, for example, the UK MPA and the work they're doing for pilot safety on boarding ships. There's some amazing work going on, but unless the ship owner will actually invest and will ensure that there is proper management and superintendency and checking up and an audit trail, which most ship owners do, and P&I clubs will have their own mismanagement teams that will support ship owners in that. But it has to land squarely on the ship owner's door, I think. Some of the wider issues as to dark fleets and sanctioned fleets are governmental issues with a lot of political issues surrounding that. But yeah, I mean, the ship owner, with the support of their reputable insurers, if they're not dark fleet, it can address some of this, but it's a systems issue that the police monitor.
Yeah. MICHELA, is the P&I industry, which is, of course, is owned by the owners. Does it have a role to play in sort of turning the mirror back to the directors of P&I clubs and saying, this is your responsibility, guys? Is it the case that a company can have a genuinely strong safety culture if senior management haven't themselves been seafarers?
Yeah, I mean, all P&I clubs, we do a lot of work here. KYC has grown, and that's know your customer. So, there's a lot of checks that we have to do, particularly on existing fleet, new fleet. And so it's really important for us to do a lot of due diligence, and that is our role. And ultimately, unpredictable routing increases risk, environmental risk, because those older tankers operating outside mainstream standards may be less prepared, particularly for casualty responses, which is a huge concern for us. But ultimately, our stance is always the industry needs stronger data sharing, enforcement, flag, accountability, transparency, and we can do as much due diligence as possible. But particularly when we get into the GUO and thinking, well, who that ultimate owner is, the more opaque it is, the more harder it is for us to do that due diligence. And so from an industry standpoint, we're always advocating for that more transparency. Because ultimately that's what we have to do to progress this.
Sorry,
Mark, carry on.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Sadly, Mark, the industry has, unfortunately, over the years, only really developed some of the systems in progression following major casualties or disasters, like Safe Seas report in the UK following various of the casualties a number of years ago. So unfortunately, lessons continue to be learned, but unfortunately, seafarers and ships are at the forefront of it, and when things go wrong.
Yeah, leads me on to my next question, really, for anyone to answer, which is that most accidents have recommendations attached to the report following the review. So why do we see the same kind of accidents occurring decade after decade?
Again, I think it's lessons can be forgotten quite quickly. For example, in the UK, most people will probably know that the UK MAIB reports will not attribute blame. They're just a factual investigation as to what's happened. Similar in certain states in the US. But realistically, it does take very major issues before there's development. And most of the time, that is when there's oil on the beaches or sadly deceased seafarers, which is not the way it should be. And we shouldn't wait for that situation to happen. We should be more proactive rather than reactive, sadly.
And Gordon, any insights on why we keep making the same mistakes decade after decade?
I don't know. I think like Mark says, we tend to have a flood of the same kind of issues, and then we, as an industry, start to highlight it and go after it, and then slowly over time I wouldn't say forget, but some other problem surpasses it, and we generally tend to lose the lose the importance of that particular issue.
And Mark, I know from the IMO again that there's a session this week, but IFSMA, which is the International Federation of Shipmasters Association, has been presenting to the IMO on issues surrounding protection of masters and officers from the major issue that's been a concern for a number of years about the increasing criminalisation of seafarers, which is a major issue on mental well-being as well. But they're presenting. So a lot of these things are being talked about and trying to change the world that the seafarer works in, but it just takes time, sadly. And again, if you're at governmental level, it can take years and years and years.
Agreed. Well, yes, we're all aware the IMO is a parliament, not a government, and the rules that are agreed there have to be implemented in the national legislatures of its members, which can take years in itself. And then different members have different resources to be able to enforce and police those measures, don't they? So there's always that to take into account. Now, I don't want to be totally down all the time. I mean, we've got to recognize that actually shipping is considerably safer than it was historically. For instance, if you look at oil spills, the number and the volumes of oil spills have been on a long-term downward trend from oil tankers and from all types of ships. And fatalities are largely on a downward trend, whether that's at sea or in operations at port, which can be quite, dangerous in themselves. So I wanted to ask each of you, what safety technology would you pinpoint as making a genuine positive change in recent years, if anything?
Again, Mark, I'll big up the P&O clubs. I think their involvement from the days of when Carl Lumbers was at UK Club, pushing very hard on ISM and the development of all of those systems and documentation on board, that's made a major difference. And I think every report recognises that since ISM has come into play, there's been this continued gradual decline on casualties. And unfortunately, when you have geopolitical situations such as now, then there's a lot of issues out there, and some sadly fatalities arising from that. But I think there's a lot of work gone into systems and trying to protect the seafarers. Sadly, not working in every environment, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what's really interesting here is, in shipping, it is quite cyclical. And as you previously mentioned, we do see trends, but ultimately, if we think about the frequency of incidents and the severity, well, the frequency may have gone down, the severity may have increased just by nature of larger ships, different technologies, significant costs that are involved now. But one thing I will say is as a P&I club, all of the P&I clubs do work very collaboratively through the international group of P&I clubs. And so there are various different committees, whether we're looking at salvage, sustainability, even the reinsurance contract. We do share data and we do share trends and we do have insight. And across all the P&I clubs, we do have that connection to our own ship owners where we can get information out there. And through our loss prevention teams that are issuing guidance, articles, when we do notice trends. So, for example, scrap metal fires, which you may have heard a lot over the last few months. There's a lot of information that we've posted online. We are able to share guidance quite quickly with our ship owners to highlight best practices, trends, insights. And so we can really support ship owners in that way in making sure that they may have insight into their own specific operations, but we have very broad insight, not only just to our own fleets, but also across all of the P&I, which of course is 90% of the world's tonnage. And so I think that's something that's worked very well, will continue to work well. And particularly when we have that network in the broader industry and we have a seat at the table through the IG, we're able to really represent our ship owners and ensure that their message is getting across. And that's the thing I would say is a very proud thing about being part of kind of the P&I network.
Gordon.
Yeah, at risk of how to say, just repeating what Mark and MICHELA have just said. I think my previous life was with a ship owner. The collaboration nowadays is much better than it used to be. People are willing to, I wouldn't say air their dirty laundry, but they're willing to discuss. They're willing to share with other people. We were on the Container Safety Forum and the Vehicle Carrier Safety Forum, which obviously mainly started by the P&I clubs, but there is much more of a will and a wish to learn from our mistakes, but also from other companies' mistakes. And it's just that bigger collaboration, that bigger wish to to collaborate is really improved vastly in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mark, sorry, Mark, me again interrupting. I think things like the Allianz annual report on statistics of casualties is great. Some of the statistics that come out of Lloyd's and the IUMI are really quite useful for trying to spot trends. Another example is liquefaction of cargoes and all the work that's been put in there for safety of seafarers.
Without a doubt, data has become much more available and much more useful and usable to be able to improve operational safety on board ships and in operations as well, for sure. Let me offer a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A. Just to answer, somebody very briefly asked, Mark, could you repeat the ships' names that you mentioned at the top of the conversation?
Yeah, of course I will. There were 3 ships, the Stella Ruby, the Asphalt Star, and then a tanker called the Chiltern, which was previously called the Al Jafzia, Jafzia.
Thanks. Somebody else has asked, a few people have asked actually, can we get a copy of the recording? Yes, that will be made available. I think we'll be putting it up on the Maritime London YouTube channel in due course. So watch out for that. Somebody has asked, the bridge collapse in Baltimore has put a magnifying glass to many of the issues mentioned today. There are criminal indictments involving the shoreside management. Will this casualty prove to be the beginning of a new chapter of accountability in shipping? So really, how important is accountability to a safety culture?
I think the Dali is a major issue, particularly with all of the information that's come out from the investigations in the States. There's still lessons to be learned from the Ever Given, but there's litigation ongoing about that casualty as well. To be honest, we lawyers sometimes get too involved in cases, but some cases do need to get through litigation so that lessons can be learned and decisions can be made that can then be acting on change. But certain casualties, particularly with the high-profile nature of the Dali, we hope that they will make some difference.
We've mentioned, the difficulty of criminalisation of seafarers, but Gordon, is there a difference between accountability and criminalisation?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are a lot of cases where different jurisdictions are, have different interpretations of the same thing, and yeah, how to say, just because the master is the master and commander of the ship, does that mean he's fully liable for everything that's going on board that ship? There have been cases, many documented cases whereby, how to say, there's been something untoward on the vessel, which might have been the other crew or through some other perpetrators. And they're squarely, how to say, putting all the blame on the master, which in some ways is not correct. We heard at the Nautical Institute's seminar last week that this term of weaponization of the vessel. There are certain jurisdictions are really just using the vessel as a way to get some money or some political gain. So yeah, as we've mentioned, it's really a big issue, and it cannot, how to say, help with the mental health and the worries and concerns of the the people that are sailing at sea today.
Thank you. One of our audience has written in the Q&A, there is an issue with the regulation of flag states, as they should be required to log a ship's beneficial owner with their contact details. How do we stop inadequate flag states? Steps are being taken to identify fake flag states, as we are seeing with ships being stopped on that basis. International registries have incredibly improved their safety performance over the last few decades, but with the deglobalization perhaps of the regulatory framework, is the flag state of an individual vessel going to become more vital to the safety of that vessel, particularly with regard to, for instance, being offered support from the military navy of that flag state?
Absolutely, Mark. And I think flag state and flags of convenience have been a hot topic in shipping for as long as I've been around, and way before my time. Flags of convenience are there for commercial and tax beneficial rather than tax avoidance arrangements. So that will always be there. So you will have some flag states where they are just literally a brass plaque, as we know from AD Board Street Monrovia back in the day. Will reputable flag states, such as what the actions of Panama, I think there's a lot more to be done, but there will always be those registries set up to get around the problem, particularly if we do have this split of the fleets and it's a long-term issue.
It's very chicken and egg, as we've seen. It's an issue as old as time, which Mark alluded to. But I think ultimately we are seeing there are some quite sophisticated systems and models out there, particularly I'm sure many of the P&I clubs do leverage. And when we are doing our due diligence, it's very important that we check not only one source, but multiple sources to really try and hone in, and to establish certain criteria along with each ship owner and each fleet. And so I'm confident that the technology will improve, as will some of these algorithms and systems. And I think AI will play a massive role here to try and uncover what's going on.
Thanks. And on that point, to each of you, shipping has become much safer than it was, say, 50 years ago. Perhaps we don't do enough to celebrate the remarkable achievements that we've mentioned. But what's the next frontier? Is it AI? Is it integrating AI proactively? Is it minimizing fatalities? Is it improving mental health and well-being? Is it changing organizational culture? What if you could change one thing today to make a step change in operational safety for vessels and seafarers? What would that be?
I think on a tech front, and again, Gordon may know far better than I, But there is a suggestion that actually moving to more low Earth orbit satellite systems may well be a huge step forward for the shipping industry, subject to them being able to get the hardware on board to actually to deal with that. Because that low orbit stuff, such as Iridium, the signals cannot be blocked. They're too strong, too wide. And linked to that, if that tech can assist, so we can get around all of the issues with jamming, spoofing, meakening, whatever these terms are used these days, that will make everyone's life a lot easier. But is that information something that every member of the public should be able to see, sat in their armchair, and then weaponize that information?
MICHELA or Gordon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my world, decarbonisation is key. And I think ultimately within shipping, there is a mutual kind of consensus that the industry does need to decarbonise, which I think has taken time and has also been challenged when we look at the geopolitical climate and we can see the fragmentation of this conversation. However, I think ultimately, whilst we have kind of alternative fuels at one end, and at the other end, we have kind of route optimization, particularly where retrofitting is not always possible. I think generally the industry is focused on decarbonisation, integrating sustainability where possible, and even very, very small things, bringing the seafarer into the conversation. I was talking to a ship owner just 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about on board, they updated all of their recycling practices. Now, that's a very small thing, but ultimately, if we think about the fleet and we think about tapping into behavioural psychology, actually, that's a big step in shifting the cultural mentality on board of not only day-to-day practices of the seafarer, but actually that is one step in the right direction where we can move towards thinking about more of those bigger measures to work towards decarbonisation. But ultimately, I think that is really the next big thing, and already is a big thing. And to finish on a positive note, I'm quite excited. I think the industry has a lot to offer here. I think the conversations that we're having is great. And what I'm particularly encouraged by is, a couple of years ago, these conversations were happening in conferences and really on webinars. But actually today, I'm seeing kind of the practical outcomes. I'm seeing changes in fleets. I'm seeing that willingness and that seeing things happening in practice. And so I'm very encouraged by the industry. And, it's an industry as old as time. And I think although things do take time, the industry is very adaptable. And I'm sure that we will see great things to come.
Yeah, I think from my side, it is an exciting time. It's a very busy time. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The training is one of the biggest things in getting people into the industry, but I think, the main problem is making it attractive. I went to sea, it was 24 years with my original company. How many guys and girls now actually, want a career deep sea, want to stay the distance? Not very many. So we have to we have to really increase on the cadet training programs and make it attractive, to the people that want to go to sea.
Yeah, I think Clarkson's Farm TV show on Amazon has showed that you can be a TikTok influencer and a farmer. If the kids don't want to work hard but want to be TikTok influencers, perhaps we need to show them you can be a seafarer and a TikTok influencer. So anyway, if we, as drawing to the end of our time, we've talked about, the advances that have been recently, the changes in technology and organizational practice and so on. You talked about what you think has made the biggest change in the last few years. Let's assume it's 2036 and we're revisiting this in 10 years' time. What would you hope would have changed by then to make shipping a safer activity?
I think there's things I can see a couple of questions popping in, but I think we have to get used to the fact that the geopolitical situation is the new norm for at least that time period. And I think you've got to try and horizon scan and see where the next hidden war is going to be, and it may not be physical missiles flying about. It could be cyber. It could be any type of pressure point around choke points is the new term. But ideally, I think as long as there is focus on the seafarer and the fact that whatever the ship owner may ask, the seafarer should be put front and center as to any decisions to be made, sending to war zones or the like, then we're going to be in a better place. And focusing on mental well-being, I think, is something we really must do in the next 10 years to make sure we can monitor and track where that's going.
Yeah, no, I agree. The crew welfare has to be first and foremost, and the mental health of the seafarers. Middle East isn't going to change. It's been a problem for many years, and it's unlikely to go away. And as mentioned, last week, if Ukraine is settled, then there's a chance that Russia will start to look at other parts of Europe. So there's always going to be something, to worry about. And yeah, we need to, the ship owners to really think about the crew and their welfare. And yeah, that collaboration and, make it like the ship is the crew's asset, and it's partially their to take ownership of the situation and have a part and a say in what's going on.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I echo both Gordon's and Mark's comments here. I think it's really important that the seafarer is front and center, and actually that there is a productive relationship, that ship owners are listening to the seafarer, and not only listening, but can implement their suggestions. I mentioned about the recycling program, which is actually something that came from a ship owner themselves, who really wanted to ensure that there are better practices on board. And so small things, it could be just making sure that there is broad connectivity and Wi-Fi coverage, make a huge difference. And so it's really about listening and empowering the seafarer, and having that productive relationship to implement those measures. I think then we build a resilient workforce. And in the face of geopolitical instability, retrofitting and decarbonisation requirements, and really beyond, that seafarer is empowered not only to do their job, but also to suggest further changes, as we know that the industry is just going to change over time. But it's a very exciting time, as I mentioned, and I'm very encouraged.
Thanks. I have one last question from the audience, which sort of follows on from what you've been saying. The situation in the Gulf and Black Sea raise a major question regarding crew being given free choice in refusing entrance into a war risk area. What are the panel's thoughts on this? I mean, we've all said we have to put the seafarer front and center. If the seafarer refuses to take the voyage, where does that leave us?
Yeah, well, I think that's a fair point made by I think that's Mr. Walters, and I know James very well. I think the issue there is if the seafarer is empowered and they say no, and we've seen this happen on some of the Gulf transits, I think, then they should have the ability to be transferred off the ship and without prejudice to their career. But there will probably always be seafarers who would be prepared to do that as long as they're given a choice on the risk they are taking, as well as the ship owner. And let's not forget the charterers and the cargo interests, which shipping is there to serve.
Thanks, Mark. Well, we've just about come to the end of our time, so I would like to thank Mark Lloyd, Gordon Lowe, and MICHELA BORZONI for taking the time to join us today and to give us the benefit of their vast expertise and experience. Thank you to everybody who's joined to listen to us today, and thank you for your questions and insights that you put into the Q&A. So from London, from Maritime London, as part of UK Maritime Safety Week, thank you to each and every one of you for joining us, and we'll end it here. Thanks again.
Thank you.